this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In those key interwar years, Belgium found itself juggling neutrality and neighbouring Germany rearming. The country needed to modernise its defences. Among Belgium's key pieces of military equipment was the T-13 tank destroyer, an armoured vehicle that, whilst modest by international standards, played a significant role in the country's efforts to resist the 1940 invasion. In this episode, we're heading virtually to Brussels to explore the story of the T-13 with Robby Houben from the Belgian Royal Military Museum. Robby, thanks for joining me. Now, I don't know much about the Belgian army. Coming out of the First World War, did the country cut back on military spending, which usually affected the mechanisation programmes, or sharing a border with Germany and being occupied, did Belgium feel the need to maintain a strong modern army? I assume the First World War was on people's minds when the country was rebuilding its military.
Yes, exactly. Belgium, during World War I, of course, we had been invaded, and all but a very small faction of our country was occupied during World War I for 4 years. We only held on to a small part of Belgium behind the Iser River on the little western tip of the country. And of course, after the war, the whole part of Belgium had to be rebuilt. Everything had to be reinstigated, and the Belgian army as well had to be properly restructured, because we had suffered a lot during those years, also in manpower, of course. And we see that during the first years after World War I, Belgium actually held a small defensive force, but the government invested more in the rebuilding of the country. And they actually held on to this doctrine of neutrality, and they sought collective security and international agreements with other countries, more like through the League of Nations, or we also had this treaty of the Locarno Pact, where we had a treaty together with our neighbors, France, Great Britain, Germany, that they would assure our borders. And of course, by treaties like this, we didn't really have a lot of worries on our minds of another potential invasion, so that we could concentrate on the 20s of really rebuilding the country. After World War I, however, we did saw the potential of new armoured vehicles, and Belgium also in 1919 also created their first tank corps. And they bought around a little bit more than 50 Renault FT tanks from France, and that was the first Belgian tank regiment, actually. We had them from 1919 till 1934, so 15 years, because by the 30s they were completely obsolete. That was the 20s, but then we have the 30s, and we can see in Europe that tensions are rising again. Hitler comes to power. Things are getting a lot of unsettled at the moment. The League of Nations proved to be quite ineffective. There were annexations, there are little wars breaking out everywhere. And in this period, Belgium actually shifts to a policy of more independence from its neighbors and armed neutrality. It wants to protect itself against a potential enemy invasion again. We also see that it would formally abandon its alliances with its neighbors to become more independent on its own. And also in that period, the country begins rearmor again, reinvesting in its military, fortifying its borders. For example, building the famous fort at Eben Emael, which was considered the most modern fort in Europe, maybe in the world at that period. They also dug a really large canal from Antwerp to Liège, which is more than 100 meters wide, and it was an enormous anti-tank ditch on the eastern part of the country, fortified also with bunkers at every bridge. Also, we had a lot of old forts around Liège and Namur. They started to modernize them as well. So really investing in a defensive infrastructure. And by doing this, they would hope to deter an invasion, not by siding with any major power around them, but just rearming themselves, not siding with anyone and not provoking anyone as well. So also in this period of the 1930s, we see a gradual mechanization, some investments in new transport vehicles, artillery, tractors, also the vehicle that we will talk about today, the new T-13 tank destroyers, but mostly in quite small numbers. We were a small country, but so all these investments are not that enormous. Also some investments in Air Force. We had some designs of our own of the company Renard, but we also had some British designs, the Ferry Fox and the Ferry Battle, sorry. Also the Gloucester Meteor. We also bought some Fiat CR42 Falcos. So a bit of a, investment from all over Europe. And at the end, we also had a small platoon of Hawker Hurricanes, which are the most modern in the Belgium Air Force when the invasion in 1940 happened. But also close to the invasion of 1940, we were a small country, but we had quite a large army actually for being a small country like that. We had many mobilizations, and we finally counted an army of 650,000 troops, of which half of them were combatants. So that's for a small country of 8 million people, that's quite large. Yeah. So that was like 8% of the total Belgian population, sort of less, and 20% of the male population that was in the army. So I think that percentage-wise, that was maybe the largest of Europe.
Is that conscript army? I presume it must be a conscript army with the people cycling. Well, it's not to say everyone else is, to some extent, was a conscript army. That is massive.
Indeed. Like in the few years before the war started, we can see that with each new action of Nazi Germany, an annexation or a different war, we see these different kinds of mobilization waves, and eventually they turned up with quite a large army. In comparison, in 1940, the British Expeditionary Force, which was present in Europe since the invasion of Poland, they had 450,000 troops. France a bit over 2 million, mostly in the border fortifications, and Germany around 3 million. So it's quite a force to be present with.
But it's a defence force. It's not actually expected to go out. It's only defending its own. It's a large number of men in actually a very small area.
Indeed. And coming back to your question of mechanization, in this period of the 1930s, there was some motorization, but a lot of the troops, they were still reliant on horses. We also had a lot of bicycle regiments that had to move quickly with their bicycles, of course. But the Belgian defenses were mostly concentrated on these fortresses around the borders, around this inner circle of fortifications. So mostly concentrated on that. Also, the strictly neutral policy, instigated mostly by our King Leopold III, it made it also impossible to prepare a coordinated defense with our French and British former allies. I say former because they formerly were our real allies with which we cooperated. But since 1936, the Belgian King Leopold, he doesn't consider them as allies, but more as guarantees of our neutrality. So they were only asked to help us, to have the assurance that they would help us during an invasion, but they were not considered as real allies, just not to provoke anyone in Europe, actually. So that was a kind of their thinking with this. Interesting
nuance to it when Britain goes to war during the First World War, with "Remember Belgium" being the slogan and the excuse for going to war in 1914. I'm slightly intrigued by the fact that the tank corps was obsolete in 1934 in Belgium. Did it morph into something else?
Exactly.
Or do they just... okay. So did they actually start again with the tank? Was the tank corps essentially big First World War era tanks up until the early 1930s?
Yeah, up until then it was a real tank corps, but this is also linked to one of the teams that led to the creation of this new vehicle that we'll talk about today. There were like a few teams that we'll go over, and the first one was Belgium. Of course, again, the Belgium neutrality, which was in the 30s a very important factor. So from 1936 onwards, Belgium does not ally with any of the other countries around it, but they start their armed neutrality. They want to invest in the military means to be able to defend themselves and not be reliant on someone else. And this does not only mean that they would protect the German border, but also the border from France. They sent troops to the both borders just to not give a different impression that they would side with any of the two. So they would invest equally in both, actually. Yeah, this decision was largely driven by King Leopold III, who actually sought to avoid any entanglement with one of the other great powers in Europe, and they would hope that this kind of neutrality would protect the Belgian sovereignty of its territory. So they invest in fortifications, a little bit also in modernization, but mostly they seek assurances from Great Britain, France, and Germany that this neutrality would be respected, but no alliances. They would not allow, for example, Great Britain to station troops on this territory, which would be able to help when someone would invade, but they had to wait at the borders and could only enter our territory when we were invaded. That would also have been a difference during the invasion, is if France and Great Britain would have troops that were already in the territory, then we would be more quickly to man the lines and protect effectively our territory. But as part of this neutral stance, Belgium also favored what they would call defensive weapons. And defensive weapons, not only fortifications, which of course bunkers are essentially defensive means, but also in name, this corps of combat tanks with the Renault FTs. It was disbanded because it sounded assault tanks, sounded too aggressively for the Belgian military stance and politically as well. They wanted to avoid using terms like that. And the Belgian tank corps was replaced by a corps of anti-tank and accompanying weapons in 1935. So really, the terminology actually really mattered to them. They found that the word tank was too aggressive, and they named their vehicles names like autocannon, automitrailleuse, that sounded less aggressively to them, less offensive to any of our neighbors that had ideas of invading. So just not to provoke.
Well, I guess as well, if you think about the milieu of time of how tanks are going to be used, they're seen as breakthrough weapons. There you've got Achtung Panzer, talking about breakthroughs and charging through. So actually, if you're not talking about the tanks as the infantry tank or the cruiser tank for breaking through, you're looking at anti-tank as the opposite. This is defending against the theory of the breakthrough using the tank.
Actually, from that point onward, we also didn't really have proper tanks. We had a few tankettes, T-13s, which are not the 13, which we will talk about today, but they were like small tankettes armed with machine guns, which are also more support weapons. They were actually too light to be called a proper tank. We did have 10 Renault ACG1s, but 10, that's like a small platoon.
You say that, but the German tanks at this period are not exactly the big heavily armoured behemoths that you think of. There's many of them are only small cannons or machine guns. So where are they looking to purchase? They're purchasing aircraft from all over the world. Where are they looking to purchase tanks from? Actually,
Belgium has this kind of tradition of trying to produce vehicles to support its own economy, especially in this period, because we're coming from the 20s, we had the economic regression, and Belgium looks for means to actually help out this economy by bringing the industry to Belgium itself. We already had a history of heavy industry, like in the Liège area, there were a lot of iron factories or steel producing factories. And so we would like to, when these FT tanks would need to be replaced, we want to find a means to actually use and boost our own economy. For example, this new vehicle that they're thinking about, T-13, producing this vehicle itself in Belgium would cost around 132,000 francs to 160,000, like in between, depending on if it was armored or not. Actually, buying this vehicle from Vickers in Great Britain would cost it 160,000. There was a large advantage in producing it on our own. Even if we would have to pay for the license cost, eventually it would be much cheaper to produce it on our own territory. And it would also, of course, be very useful for all these Belgian factories, that they could employ people, that they could be profitable. For example, for this T-13 that we'll talk about today, we had the famous Cockeriel, who produced the gun that was used in the vehicle. We have Familie Reu, another company which produced the chassis. We have FNR Stahl, which also still exists today, which produced the Browning assault rifle that was used on the tank, which was also a licensed copy of the famous bar that was used in World War II. One of the reasons was, of course, also to help our own economy by producing this new vehicle.
Well, I guess it also makes Belgium self-sufficient. If you're trying to be neutral, you can say we're not buying things from anyone else.
Yeah, exactly. So at first it was Belgium neutrality, the defensive nature of Belgium at the period, and like an anti-tank vehicle, which was basically just the motorization of an anti-tank gun that we already had. It fitted perfectly in this doctrine of not an offensive force, just a defensive means. Then economically, this new vehicle to boost the Belgian economy. That's the second reason. And the third is the strategy of mobile defense in Belgium. So in Belgium, we had our fortifications. We had a few fortified lines. But there was a certain idea in the 30s that these defensive lines would be more concentrated in the inner part of the country, like this triangle of Antwerp, Liège, Namur, France, following the Albert Canal and the Meuse River. But if we would concentrate on that small square of fortifications, that would mean that we would lose the part of Belgium that lies outside of it. Of course, many people living in Belgium were not happy with that idea. So they created this new idea of mobile defense. And for this, they instigated 2 new corps. We had the border cyclists and the chasseurs ardennais. Chasseurs ardennais, which means the Ardennes hunters. And they were mostly recruited from the areas which they were situated. And they were trained to be like a frontier unit that was situated close to the Belgian border. And they would be the first kind of force that an invading army would have to deal with. So they started from the borders. Here they would fight the first invading troops, and they would perform delaying actions when they were retreating to the main defensive line. So they would try to hold up the invading army as long as possible and do a fighting retreat to the main defensive lines, and also do, for example, sabotage, destroy bridges in there behind them. So hold up the invading army for as long as possible. And they were really trained as elite units. They got the best equipment. They were sourced from the local area where they were based. So they knew the area well. So they were really some of the best fighting units that Belgium had in May 1940. Also, the Chasseurs Ardennais, the slogan was to resist and bite. Their troop insignia was like a wild boar. So they were really made like a tremendous force. And of course, these troops, they also needed a good weapon to deal with invading vehicles. So this new T-13 tank destroyer was also really developed to give them a fighting means, a mobile anti-tank means to help out with any invading force while also retreating to the main defensive line. So Belgium neutrality, strategy of mobile defense, an economic reason for this new vehicle. There was also a political incentive. In Belgium, we had in the 30s a lot of left parties who were initially against investing too much in the army. And there were even some of the more traditional Catholic parties who wanted to return to horses more for nostalgic reasons, just to prevent all of this mechanization. Left parties, they wanted to guard peace with treaties, not really with investing in the army, but more with treaties. But it became quite clear after the militarization of the Rhineland, after annexations by Hitler in Europe, that this would not suffice to hold off peace and to hold off a new war that was coming. They decided also that eventually material reinforcement of the army would be needed to save lives eventually. We would need a strong army to guarantee our own neutrality, our own independence. And for this reason, this new tank with a rearward-facing cannon, they found suitable to a policy of that was a defensive enough weapon to also be approved by them. Yeah, I say a rearward-facing weapon. When people first see the T-13 tank destroyer, it comes off as a kind of a strange kind of vehicle with a rearward-facing armament like that. But it's also worth looking at, is this specifically a Belgium story or not? Or do other nations also have this idea of putting like a large anti-tank gun on a small carrier vehicle? And we see that in the early 30s, Vickers, Cardinal Lloyd, who of course experimented a lot with vehicles, they made a lot of carrier-based vehicles. And they also did some similar experiments as well. We have this vehicle called the VAT-50. It was in the early 30s and had a 40 millimeter anti-tank gun on top of it. Not a 2-pounder, that was developed a bit later, but also a 40 millimeters gun. And when developing this vehicle, they had a lot of correspondence between the Belgian military staff as well, because they were also looking at a similar concept. And we see that a lot of correspondence is shared with the test results in between them. So they were really interested in that. Germany also had a mounted 47 millimeter gun on their Panzer I, which becomes the Panzerjäger 1, but that was only used in like 1940. It only turns up in Europe quite late. They did have Guderian's Achtung Panzer, where he also advocates for mobile anti-tank means and a mobile anti-tank force, but he talks about using trucks, not really on a mobile tracked vehicle. France also experiments in this period with self-propelled anti-tank guns, but they mostly only come up with the AMR-35 ZT2, which is like a small tank with a 25 millimeter anti-tank gun, but they're not really produced in large numbers, so also quite negligible. They do have the lovely W15 TCC, Chasseur des Chars, also a tank hunter, which is also a truck with rearward-facing cannon on its back, also rearward-facing. So They have a few of those during the invasion in 1940, but not really the same, not a tracked-based vehicle.
Now, that's a bit like the Portee that the British had in the desert.
Exactly.
Never really.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a desperation measure rather than being particularly good.
A few other countries, Italy and Poland, also experiment with putting anti-tank guns on their carrier-based vehicles, but they mostly left it with a few at a time, with prototypes, not really with a large serial production. So arguably, Belgium was one of the first ones, together with Vickers, to develop this concept and really put it into a serious production vehicle, which was actually used in service, which was not really the case for these other nations in the mid 30s.
But is that partly because your Belgian, I might be wrong here, likes the Vickers Cardinal Lloyd carrier? So is it producing those and thinks, well, what else can we do with them? So we've got this great platform, so we're going to put machine guns, we'll have some for doing this, some doing that. Oh, hang on, I wonder if we can fit a gun on it. Oh, how do we fit a gun? Because they are quite small to put a... It was that part of their thinking. We can have one platform that does multiple things. Can we fit a gun on it, and how do we do it?
The actual thought was, we have this good anti-tank gun, which is the 47mm FRC Royal Cannon Foundry gun, which, it was a really nice gun, and they were looking for a means to better deploy it, actually, because this gun, it had good performance, but it was quite heavy to deploy, and they were looking for a means to more easily transport it along with the cavalry units, the infantry units, just to make it easier to deploy this quite heavy gun. Belgium, they had a lot of correspondence with Vickers Cardinal Lloyd. Even in the early 30s, around 1930, they were already discussing this idea, and Vickers had at this moment the Vickers Cardinal Lloyd Mark VI Tankette, which is quite a tiny vehicle. And Belgium bought 6 of them to test out as an artillery tractor for its artillery guns that it had. They found out that the vehicle was a bit too slow to their liking. It would be able to be used with infantry, but not really with cavalry units, which would have to go faster, because this vehicle could only go around 32 kilometers an hour, which was considered too slow. But then they think of, what else can we do with this vehicle? And maybe we can make some adaptations on it to be able to carry our 47mm gun. So this quite large anti-tank gun they would put on this really, really small Vickers Cardinal Lloyd carrier vehicle. And these tests were also probably influenced by the test that Vickers was already doing with this VAT-50 vehicle. But this Belgium 47mm, it was a bigger gun, a more powerful gun with a lot more recoil and muzzle velocity. So this really put the chassis of this carrier vehicle on a lot of strain. It was really too big of a gun for a small vehicle like that. And when Belgium was testing this new vehicle that they made, they also shared the result with Vickers, and Vickers compared it with putting an elephant on a flea. So it was really too big of a gun for a small vehicle. However, the test results of the 47mm gun, they stayed the same, and they were satisfactory for the Belgian army. And this vehicle, also the moving tests were also good enough for the Belgian army, although the vehicle kind of wobbled a bit because of the large gun on top of it. But they found it acceptable as a transitory vehicle. So they didn't look at producing more of them, but the 6 of them that they had already bought and adapted with the new anti-tank gun, they would keep those and use them with the Chasseur Ardennais, 6 of them. They added the gun on top, and also a small gun shield at the front to protect the crew with 5 to 9 millimeters of armor. So they were a bit protected while doing their operations, but not from the sides, not from the back, not from the top. So really only a small gun shield. But the advantage of a small vehicle like this is that it would be easy to camouflage it. So that's one advantage that they had.
It'd be very low. It must be very low as well.
Yeah, indeed. Mm-hmm. It's really a tiny vehicle. But already in the same year that they developed this vehicle, they were already looking at replacing it with a better idea. So these 6 vehicles end up with the Chasseur Ardennais. And later they were moved to a border regiment to be stationed like with the fortress troops over there to protect in any border invasion. And they actually also fought in 1940. They fired a few rounds across the canal to the invading armies. It's not really clear what happened afterwards. There are some rumors that they were dumped in the canal, but we actually have no idea where they actually ended up.
Those dredged the canal looking for what would be a priceless piece of military hardware. So what lessons does the Belgian military take away from that when they're looking to modify? Is the T-13 a modification or something separate from those sort of Carden Lloyd Vickers bases?
So the T-13, after these early experiments with this vehicle, Vickers develops a new vehicle, which is the Light Dragon Mark I, a new carrier vehicle, actually developed as an artillery tractor. Belgium also finds out about it, is very interested. They buy a prototype. And in 1934, they've tested the prototype, and they found it a very good vehicle to work further with. And they purchased the license to also produce it in Belgium. And that's 1934. In that year, the Belgian army, they order from the Belgian firm Mise 56 of these vehicles, of the Belgian-produced Vickers Carden Lloyd artillery tractors, and they name it the T-13. So the T-13 is actually just the carrier, not the tank destroyer, so just the carrier itself. And of these 56 vehicles that they order from this Belgian company, they order 35 of them to be armored and with the anti-tank gun, and 21 not. So these first 35 of them, they're going to be the first T-13 tank destroyer Type 1, and the 21, which are not armored or not armed, they're going to be artillery tractors for the Chasseurs Ardennais, which use them to track as tractors for their 75mm Beaufort guns. So the first ones are going to be the Belgian Type 1 tank destroyer, and the production of those starts in 1934, and they end up in production in 1935, the year afterwards. So compared to this previous vehicle, the small tankette, this first T-13 Type 1, it has double the amount of ammunition that could be stored on the vehicle. It has better protection for the crew, which is operating the anti-tank gun. And it's also easier to handle the 47mm gun because it's a larger vehicle. There's much more maneuver space inside. And also with this vehicle, the gun could turn 360 degrees, so it could fire all directions without the vehicle moving. While this previous vehicle, the vehicle itself also had to move to change the gun itself. However, it's a larger vehicle than the previous one, but it's still essentially a small vehicle. It's only 3.8 meters long, 2 meters wide, and around 2 meters high as well. And it weighs around 4.5 tons. The engine, it's a 5-cylinder Meadows engine, also British, I believe. It has around 55 horsepower, which allows the vehicle to go around 45 kilometers an hour, which was considered decent enough. As I first said, the 47mm gun is installed facing the back of the vehicle, so where the rear is positioned. And there has always been this myth that this vehicle was specifically developed in this policy of Belgian neutrality, and that it was intentionally aimed at the back just to be a non-provoking posture for the vehicle itself. So that would be perfectly in line with Belgium's diplomatic stance as a strictly neutral country with a strictly neutral vehicle as well. But this is not really true. There are more practical reasons actually for it. If the gun would be facing forward, it would be right next to the head of the driver of the vehicle, and that could cause considerably ear damage because it has quite a loud bang, and also the muzzle flash is also reputed to be quite long, around 6 meters, so quite dangerous for him. We have this one experience from the 1940 campaign of a Belgian soldier standing too close to the gun firing. He claims that he burned his eyebrows, he burned his mustache, and after this loud bang, he never heard a canary sing again. So it must have been quite the experience. Another reason, the vehicle at the front, it has an armored cabin with like panels that could be folded down that protect the crew operating the vehicle. If the gun would be facing forward, it would have to be higher than these armored panels to fire forwards. And that would make the vehicle very high and visible, which is, of course, not really useful for a tank destroyer. The bigger the vehicle, the less useful it is. And also, if it would be facing forward, they would need an armored cabin at the back, so they would have to change up the whole setup of the vehicle. So it was much more useful to make it like this, since it would also be mostly used for like delaying actions. Another one, this vehicle was already designed before the strict Belgium neutrality of 1936. It was developed 1 or 2 years before that. So it was not that the developers were really thinking about this neutrality in their mind. This was the first Belgian T-13 Type 1 tank destroyer. We have 2 different types as well. As I said, in this first order, a few of them were ordered as the Belgian T-13 tank destroyer Type 1, but there are also a few of them ordered as artillery tractors. Well, now in 1937, the chasseurs Ardennais, which were using these artillery tractors, they came into contact with other units which use trucks for handling their artillery guns. And they actually see them using them, and they find that they were a bit jealous. They also want trucks to handle their guns because they're faster, they're more easy to maneuver, they don't lose tracks, they don't tend to lose a track. They ask for their T-13 artillery tractors also to be replaced by trucks. Of course, Belgium allows it, and this 21 artillery tractors that were used by chasseurs Ardennais, they are actually converted also to the T-13 tank destroyer, and that becomes a Type 2. Visually, there's almost no difference to the first type. There are a few small things, a few changes to the turret, a towing hook was added, but there are not really big differences. The whole general layout of the vehicle stays the same. Also in the same year, the Belgium T-13 Type 3 is being conceived. They were also continuously thinking about how can we further improve this vehicle, what is wrong with it, how can we better develop it. It was also the case that Vickers had just developed a new carrier vehicle, the Light Dragon Mark II. It was a more powerful vehicle, it had a better engine, and Belgium decided that this could be a useful testbed to develop a new tank destroyer upon. Well, not really new, but the third type of their vehicle. And it was actually a new model to replace the previous 2 ones. They used the chassis of the Light Dragon Mark II, and on this vehicle, they make a complete armored superstructure. So it would be a fully enclosed armored cabin on top of it, and with also a turret. So much better protection, a fully enclosed armored turret. Well, not really fully enclosed because the turret and the armored superstructure were still open at the back. This was the most produced version of it. They initially ordered 333, but the vehicle was being produced up until Belgium was invaded, and eventually they only end up with around 237, which is still a lot more than the 50 of the previous 2 types, actually. It has the same dimensions of the previous 2. It only is a bit higher because of the new turret that they added. It has a more powerful engine as well, 6-cylinder, 80 horsepower compared to the 55 horsepower of the previous one. So also much better conditions for moving around. It could go about 57 kilometers an hour. But there's also this one testimony during the May 1940 campaign when the Belgian army was retreating a lot. There was this one soldier who was retreating downhill with his vehicle, and he reached 70 kilometers an hour with it, which is, of course, not good for the vehicle, but he was able to retreat.
Bouncing about in it, I imagine. I can't imagine it's comfortable at that speed.
Exactly. Yeah, it has a gasoline engine, around 4 hours of operation with a full tank. And this last vehicle was also produced in 3 sub-versions, actually. We had an A version, which had a 3-man crew. It had more ammunition, and was used actually for these frontier troops because they had to perform long delaying action, so they had to carry more ammunition for these long operations. The second B version had a 4-man crew, and this one was intended for fortress troops to support their anti-tank capabilities in these fortress areas. So it had a 4-man crew just to ease out the operation of the vehicle, to help out with loading and things like that. Then we also had a C version, which had a 3-man crew and a radio for communication, because all the other ones, they didn't have any radio, and they're still dependent on runner dispatches or signaling to communicate with other vehicles and the infantry around it. So this last version also had a radio. These 3 vehicles, they're mostly, during the May 1940 campaign, they were a bit notoriously for their many breakdowns as well. But that was also because the units that were using it in the May 1940 campaign, which were most in action, like these frontier units, they had mostly the older types, because they had been the first ones to receive the vehicle. So they also kept most of the older ones. So these vehicles were already 5 years in service back then, which was quite long, of course. So some reliability issues. What were the reasons for this? The first one would be probably misuse of the crew going too fast. Belgium had to retreat a lot during those days, and it didn't went that smooth all the time. So there's one testimony of this T-13 driver, and he is actually in a column following a motorcyclist. But the motorcyclist is not considerate of the speed of the vehicles behind it, and he's going quite fast. The T-13 driver, he doesn't want to lose the vehicle in sight, and he maintains the same speed. And then taking a sharp turn, he ends up driving onto the porch of a house. So silly things like that happened as well, just because of the retreat. There was chaotic conditions, and they didn't want to lose the column, of course. Another reliability issue is that the chassis of this vehicle was really overloaded. Like the base of the vehicles, these light Dragon artillery tractors, they were actually tractors meant for pulling artillery pieces, not to be adapted to a combat vehicle. And we have this phenomenon of a rate creep. And it means like you have this vehicle, you keep on adding small stuff, and eventually it becomes a much heavier vehicle than you anticipated. So the T-13 Type 1 and 2, they would weigh 4 tons, 600 kilograms in combat order, while 4 tons, 250 kilograms would be the actual limit for the chassis as well. So it would be too heavy. For the Type 3, it was planned to weigh around 5 tons, 900 kilograms, so almost 6 tons. But after Vickers found out about these plans, they complained that many breakdowns would occur because it would simply be too heavy for this kind of vehicle. And so they asked that they would lower the total weight of the vehicle to 5,300. And when the Belgians tried to lower it, they replaced wooden ammo boxes with larger ones. They made some adaptations. And eventually the vehicle would weigh a little bit less, but still too much for a chassis like that. And also these crews, they could not carry additional stuff like spare tracks or a lot of crew equipment. While doing that, during the May 1940 campaign, the vehicles were much overloaded, and that's also how breakdowns would occur. Maybe what can I say about the suspension of the vehicle? They use a horseman type of suspension. It has a front drive wheel plus 6 road wheels, actually. And what is very specific for the first type is that the last of the drive wheels, it would be at a ground level like the other wheels. With most combat vehicles, you can see that it is a little bit higher, which help by crossing obstacles. So this being at the same ground level would really make it difficult for the Type 1 and 2 to cross obstacles while going in reverse. So that also gives them some issues while crossing obstacles. Yeah, but this would not be an offensive vehicle, so normally they would also be driving
the other way around. Yeah,
exactly.
Less of a consideration.
And with the Type 3, they remedied this issue by making the last drive wheel a little bit higher, and they also added some return rollers, which were also not present on the different one. Also, it had steel tracks, and they were reputed to be quite loud. The crews complained about them, that they couldn't talk to each other because while driving, they were quite loud. And they also tended to skid while driving on ice or cobblestones, which are very present in Belgium cities as well. So it also sometimes gave some issues. These armored artillery tractors, they received some armor in the T-13 tank destroyer, and it was made from rolled steel folding plates. And the Type 1 and 2, they had these steel plates that could be folded upwards or down. So in combat operations, it will be folded upwards to protect the crew. But when driving, they would mostly be lowered because it would give them better visibility for the driver.
It's quite a clever design. It's almost like, if people who've not seen, it's like a window of a Jeep that pushes forward, but they're the plates all the way around that sort of flip down. How thick was that armour? How much could it? I presume it would stop at least small arms fire.
So the armored steel plates were 9 millimeters. And this would be at least strong enough for the Belgian armor-piercing bullet. That was what they had in mind. It could be at least hard enough to stop that. But anything over a 20-millimeter bullet would penetrate it. So in the real combat conditions, it was really not intended to be on the front line fighting stronger units than that.
But presumably from their point of view, with their low height, they could be well concealed, and hopefully they'll be taking out what's about to shoot at them before they could be shot at.
Yeah, exactly. And also the crews, they camouflage their vehicles. When you see images of them, they look like driving bushes, like they're really putting branches, rolled trees on top of it. So yeah, they really had a doctrine of anti-tank, and they had to conceal their vehicles. So indeed. With the Type 3, it's a bit better protected because it has this more enclosed armored superstructure, but it's still open at the back. So they also discussed, like, should we add armored shutters to close it down, or should we maybe have a tarpaulin just to to close it? But this would only mean that it would be that it would add weight to the vehicle, and also a tarpaulin.
Hang on, but when you say it's open at the back, does that mean it's open at the front?
No,
or open
sorry,
at the back?
I had to. That's an important one.
This is going to get confusing.
Yeah, that's an important one that I had to specify. So the Type 3, it has a forward-facing gun, and it is open at the back. So they also changed the whole setup, but indeed it has a forward-facing gun, and that one is open at the back. They left it open because armored shutters would add weight, and adding a tarpaulin as a cover, it would only have an illusory effect. It would not protect anything. So also, while keeping it open, it would help with the evacuation of gases from firing the gun. It would help it with not having overpressure when the vehicle would be hit, things like that. Also, yeah, that's the armor. The crews themselves, they were also a kind of adapted helmet inside their vehicles. It was the M35 tank helmet. It looked similar to the famous Adrian helmet, but it had like a leather strap around it. It had a neck protector, and it's very similar to the helmets that the French tankers wore in that period. However, they had a specific helmet for their vehicles, but the many crews of the Chasseurs Ardennais and the border cyclists, they mostly kept on their berets while in the vehicles. And why is that? These two new units that were instigated for the mobile defense of Belgium, they were the first Belgian units to receive their berets. So they were quite proud that they were the only ones that were able to wear it. So they mostly also kept them on actually during combat. They also had black leather jackets, which of course don't give a lot of protection, but it's very useful for keeping out oil, things like that inside the vehicle. And the drivers, they were canvas overalls, which are more lighter, but it's more easy to maneuver, of course, inside the vehicle. Yeah, as I said, they also camouflaged their vehicles. They were painted in this brown khaki color, which is present in all Belgian vehicles around May 1940. Kind of chocolate brown, I would say. And some of them were also in a two-tone camo, but it's very hard on pictures to see in what colors the camouflage was actually painted. Very hard to see.
Yeah, it's always a bugbear when people, it's like military modelers discussing what colour is the right colour of green, and you can only refer to black and white photographs.
Yeah, exactly. So the Armament, that's the 47mm Belgian anti-tank gun. It's a very powerful gun for that time, arguably maybe one of the best anti-tank guns at the beginning of World War I, and it could fire anti-tank shells or HE shells, high explosive ones. It has a large muzzle flash, as we saw with this one Belgian soldier, so up to 6 to 5 meters, so it's not really a discreet gun. But it's small, it's easy to hide, quite heavy still, but they were quite happy with it. This gun was issued to infantry regiments, also to fortresses, to be put inside bunkers, and eventually also on this T-13 tank destroyer. The anti-tank shells, they had a tungsten core, which was quite good, but Belgium was really dependent for the delivery of tungsten from Great Britain. So after the war was coming to Europe, Britain wasn't able to export any tungsten anymore to Belgium, so they also changed to a new type of steel core that was produced by a Luxembourg company. And the gun had quite good armor piercing characteristics. It would be able to pierce 47mm at 300 meters, 40mm at 600, and 30mm up to 1,000 meters. So for 1914 conditions, considering the vehicles that you had at the time, that was good for stopping every German vehicle that they would encounter, actually. They also had high exploding shells that detonated on impact and was, of course, useful against softer targets, infantry, small fortifications. They were mostly used as ammo in May 1940 because it was mostly other targets that they encountered, actually. Generally speaking, the Belgians had a lot of confidence in this gun. They were quite happy with it because they compared it to the different kinds of guns that they had in France, in Great Britain, and they were quite happy about it. Next to this gun, the vehicle was also armed with a Browning assault rifle, a license produced by FN Herstal in Belgium. It's kind of a different caliber, but the gun itself stays quite the same. This has magazines of 20 bullets. They had a lot of magazines on board, and could also fire armor-piercing bullets as well. And what was useful is that they could also dismount the gun. It was normally coaxially from the main cannon, but they could also dismount it and use it against infantry or aircraft as well. You have a lot of pictures of them operating it in that condition. What was not useful was that while it's gradually, they could not using it at the same time because the turret was very limited in space, and it was impossible to both fire the cannon and the machine gun at the same time. So that was quite a disadvantage for the operators.
So it's an 18-day campaign, is the I think, isn't it, the Belgian campaign? How does the T-13 perform? In many respects, it sounds like a great piece of kit, although it's an 18-day campaign, so it's all going to be over quite quick.
So when it saw action, it actually performed quite well. It had a powerful cannon, and in these initial days or hours, you can see that they were used in a lot of delaying fights around Bastogne by the Chasseurs Ardennais, but they didn't encounter armored vehicles that much. I will mostly concentrate here on the Chasseurs Ardennais because they have a very well-documented history. And their units, they only encountered armored vehicles 3 times. And these 3 times, they were quite successful. For example, there was one of them that was able to shoot 3 armored reconnaissance vehicles, a car and 3 trucks. And later, another vehicle at Aalst who was able to disable 2 armored cars. But the first units that invaded Belgium and encountered the Chasseurs Ardennais, they were not really the crack panzer divisions with large vehicles, but mostly reconnaissance troops. So the vehicles were mostly used actually against infantry. These small reconnaissance parties actually, they weren't really involved in any big tank battles, as they say. So in these initial days, they were used more in ambushes and delaying actions, actually. Like the first Belgian troops crossing the border, encountering these first positions of the Chasseurs Ardennais, who fought with them, and then delayed while retreating to new defensive positions. You have this one account of them, which is quite interesting, which really explains actually how this was done. This was an account of one of the Chasseurs Ardennais who was stationed at the border actually when the first German troops came across the borders. I will just quote him here. "We let them approach our position. After a moment of anxiety, we unleashed death. We don't give a damn and fire round after round. It was going well, but we were quickly spotted. We started receiving fire and the armor starts to shake. We reposition 100 meters higher. We start firing again, but the Germans are not neglecting us. Their bullets fall all around us, on the armor and also on the tracks. We keep on firing without a break. The driver, who is helping out with loading the gun, is having a hard time keeping up. Besides bullets, shells are also starting to land around us, without a doubt German 3.7mm shells. We are with about 50 men and 1 tank keeping this horde at bay, despite their numerical advantage. We don't want to leave this frontier, because it is all too familiar to us. They are there in large numbers, and equally ferocious as we are. The more we cut down, the more they are coming. They are like a true army of ants." So, holding up the army.
Yeah, but presumably their ability to fight HE is useful even if in that role, because not necessarily all British tanks, good guns could fire HE. So actually, that I know it's not necessarily going to be at its best, but that dual rule must have been useful.
Yeah, very useful indeed. A few actions where it actually encountered vehicles, but it was mostly used in an infantry support role actually during the May 1940 campaign, almost exclusively used in that role. Modernise is a small village in the Luxembourg area, so really in the heart of the Ardennes, very close to the border. And that village was defended by one company, the 5th Company of the Chasseurs Ardennais. And they were able to hold out against a German full panzer division for 8 hours, so almost a full day of operations. How did this actually happen? These troops, they had not received the order to fall back to the new defensive positions. So they stood their ground until they were out of ammo and overrun because they just didn't receive the order to fall back. Why didn't they receive their order? Well, the Germans, as part of their invasion plan, they had this Operation Nieuwe. What is this operation? It would mean that the Groot-Duitsland division would be air transported 2 small Belgian villages, the villages of Nieve and Witry. Their names would become Nieuwe, the name of the operation. They would be transported there by small Vizsler-Storch, like communication liaison planes. This division would be dropped there, and they would have to disrupt enemy supply and communications, so the Belgians wouldn't be able to receive the supplies, and the radio lines would be cut. So Groot-Duitsland division did their job well. They cut the communications, and this caused for that one company of the Chasseurs Ardennais to not receive the order to fall back. And because they did not receive this order, they held out against this one German panzer division and held them up for a full day. So it turns out to be quite unlucky for the Germans that they that had Why do I mention this operation? When this was happening, the Chasseurs Ardennais also sent out patrols to fight back against this air transported division over there. And then the troops were also supported by T-13s. And one of these T-13s actually managed to shut down Junkers 52, which was supplying at low height the troops, the German troops which were present there. So that's also quite an interesting fact. Eventually, after this first border skirmishes, the Belgians, they start retreating to the new defensive lines, first to the cavalry line of Antwerp, Liège, Namur. Later, they keep on falling back and back after the Germans manage to have breakthroughs in other regions. The Belgians having to retreat time and time again after this first initial encounterment, which were quite successful for them. It really frustrates them. It was like a period of 10 days that they have to man a position, retreat again, man a new positions, and they didn't really get a chance to fight back. And this really annoyed them because they were retreating. They see images of bombed out villages and towns around them. They think about their family, what is happening with them. And they're really frustrated that they didn't get a chance to fight back. And in this period, the Chasseurs Ardennais, the T-13s, they only have to perform like rearguard duties. They have to protect the retreating columns, and they don't really have a lot of chances to fight back. And this is also very annoying because the roads at the time were swamped with Belgian refugees that were trying to get to France, to the still Belgian-occupied areas. And this really made it a hard time performing military operations there. But finally, the last of the Belgian army was like concentrated in the western part of Belgium, where they retreated behind the Leie, the Lys river. And actually in this small western part of Belgium, they had a chance to fight back. And it was also here, during these final days of the war for Belgium, that most of the casualties actually occurred for Belgium. 2/3 of the casualties that the Belgian army suffered during the 18 days campaign happened here during the Battle of the Lys River, which is several different battles and counterattacks. And during this battle, a few counterattacks were actually organized. So the Belgians had retreated behind this river, and being concentrated in this smaller part of Belgium, it also helped, of course, with their supply, and they had their artillery right behind them, so they were in a better position to defend themselves. They held out on the northwestern part of Belgium, and they were connected to the British, who held the line after that, the French troops. They all had this kind of small retreating part of Belgium, which would eventually end up at the Dunkirk evacuation. But the Belgian army, they were able to have a few small counterattacks where the T-13s would support the infantry in like reoccupying a few villages. They were successful a few times, but they were always eventually fought back after a day or so. So there was this one action where a T-13 supports this infantry regiment in a counterattack at the village of Knesselare. And here they would capture a large amount of enemy equipment and also make 118 prisoners. So small actions like that where they would just be as a support vehicle, but very useful. There was also somewhere an account of a T-13 shooting straight through a Panzer IV and hitting the half track afterwards. But I was not able to find a source for that. It's a story that is repeated a lot online, but I haven't been able to check where it occurred or if it isn't true or not. Another one of these battles that occurred was the village of Vingt. It's mostly known as the Vingt massacre due to the German atrocities that happened there, considering civilians. There was a vicious battle of the Chasseurs Ardennais, which were supported by T-13s as well. But the Germans, they actually used Belgian civilians as human shields while they were trying to cross the river over there. And they also executed some afterwards as retaliation for the hard resistance of the Chasseurs Ardennais over there. But I have this one testimony about a happy member of the Chasseurs Ardennais that was finally getting a chance to fight back and go into the offensive after all these days. And he explains, a German machine gun section is setting up 200 meters in front of us. We wait until they're all in place. The results on the target will be better. There are about 15 infantrymen. Quickly, an explosive shell in my cannon. I fire. What a result. We hear them screaming. I don't care about their crying. They are calling for their Mutti. They should have stayed with her in Germany. And you really see in these accounts that they almost became like trigger happy because of the chaos, the dust, the smoke of the gun, and they really didn't want to stop fighting. Actually, you can see that the infantry regiment around them was already retreating, but they didn't. Yeah, they just want to finally prove their valor, to prove that to their parents that they were all who fought in World War One, that they were also putting up a hard resistance. So they were really giving it all their best. And even when the combat was almost 30 meters in front of this person, he says that any German that tries to come close, I will fire upon with my pistol. So he's really motivated to give this all. There's also this one other account, which is also a village in that, in the same battle there actually. And it was a T-13 defending a position with a windmill against the German army, which was attacking it. And this T-13, it fired all of its ammunition, which is 48 HE and 48 AP rounds. It fired up all its ammunition, also all of its machine gun ammunition, almost 100 magazines of 20 bullets, until it was all gone actually. At first, it used up all of its HE ammunition. When it only had anti-tank shells, it starts firing at the concrete of the road to produce shrapnel with its gun, to fend off these German infantrymen. They were really fighting hard during these last days of the battle, just to finally prove that they still had some fight left. And also many of them were quite disappointed when the Belgian King Leopold III announced that they were surrendering, that they weren't able to hold on any longer, while they still had some fight in them, so they didn't really understand why they had to stop, while the situation was, in the broader sense, getting unbearable for the Belgian army. So also this Chasseurs Ardennais, they started the Belgian May 1940 campaign with 32 vehicles. At the end, on the 28th of May, 18 days later, they had 10 left, which they surrendered to the Germans. 5 of them were destroyed, 5 of their vehicles. 12 of them were abandoned because of mechanical issues, probably. And only 1 of them was captured and 4 of them unaccounted. So, here you can see again the mechanical issues that were, because they were using the old vehicles, that turns out to be quite unuseful. But they still had, quite a lot of them left. And of the vehicles that were abandoned, the vehicle instruction manual actually had instructions to how to sabotage the vehicle to prevent it from being used by the enemy, or partly disable the vehicle as well. But the crewmen, some of them really had been using these vehicles for a long time now, and they really didn't like to part with their vehicles. For example, at this Battle of Wingt, the person who wrote his testimony, he comes past a driver who was covered in blood and crying, and this guy, he didn't want to leave his vehicle because of his comrades has fallen in it. And when he passes this driver, he swears to them that he will avenge his comrades as well in the battle that will follow. And the person that wrote his testimony, when he eventually, at the end of the campaign, needs to surrender his tank, he claims, "I take a last look at my tank, my beautiful tank 1546, which is the license, the serial number. Slowly, I walk away a bit further until it's not more than a black dot in the distance. It is still raining. Is the war finally over? I feel like I'm still ready to serve my country." So overall, they were decent vehicles when they got a chance to prove themselves, but it didn't change really much about the bigger picture of the Belgian battles in that period. And also their effectiveness was quite limited by their employment doctrine. They were mostly used in small amounts for infantry support, not more than 4 vehicles at a time, so quickly isolated and overrun. And also they didn't have a radio, so it was really hard to communicate with them, and some of them were just like lingering about until they finally got a new order to do something. They had to rely on runner dispatches. And also in a more general sense, for all Belgian armored vehicles in this period, they're all quite small and lightly armored, but they mostly have a well armored and fast. So that's a general characteristic that's applicable for all of these vehicles. And with more than 300 vehicles in total in the Belgian army during this campaign, you would think that a large concentration would have been good for like a mechanized division or 2 for armored counterattack, which would have been very useful. But unfortunately, they only used them in like infantry support roles, only a few vehicles at a time, and this really hampered their use actually. They were using these tiny penny pockets. Of course, this doctrine is also used, for example, by the French, but they also had some independent mechanized formations, the DLM, the BCC formations, which were very useful when pitted against the German adversaries. But these Belgian ones, only in infantry support, used for delaying actions, supporting small counterattacks, and even some in static positions, which is really not how such a vehicle could be used. And of course, that also hampered their effectiveness.
Did many survive the war?
It's hard to say. Currently, Only one, but we know that a few of them also ended up after the Belgian surrender in German hands. We found some pictures that were taken right after the Belgian surrender, and there you see German troops that like to photograph themselves with their war trophies inside Belgium cities where they were probably left, and they take some pictures with them. We have some other pictures where also the vehicles are like stalled out in the city square just for people to see, like, these are the vehicles that were used, these were captured. Like most of the vehicles used by the Germans, they were also evaluated to see if they could be of use to the German army. These vehicles were also reused by them, and they would be called the Panzerjäger VA 801B for Belgium, for the T-13 Type 1 and 2, and the Panzerjäger VA 802B for the Type 3 vehicle. The Germans tested them. They took driving tests, firing tests, and during those tests, they also compared the capabilities of the gun. They compared it to the British 2-pounder gun. Unfortunately, we do not know what are the results, if they were happy with it or not, or what lessons did they learn from it eventually. We only have some pictures where we could see that they were like set up next to each other and evaluated. However, after this testing of these vehicles, we think of three functions that could have been assigned to the surviving T-13s that the Germans used. The first is anti-partisan use. And why that? Because we found pictures of these vehicles in German livery, like in German colors with German Balkan crosses on top of it. Like they were used, several vehicles, for example, a column that were used like this. They were painted gray with the German insignia on it, and they also had the SS and Totenkopf insignia on it, and also some other small modifications like the Nordic headlights on top of it. So really clearly that they were being used by the Germans. At first sight, you would think maybe they were kept in Belgium and used here, but during the early period of war, there was not really any use for a vehicle like this because there weren't the big resistance fights over here, and also that SS division wasn't situated here, so it's really clear that it was probably maybe in the Balkans or somewhere in the east in Russia that they were used like this. Also, that they were painted gray means that these photos were taken before February 1943, after which vehicles received a different color. But the Belgian resistance really started acting up only a year afterwards, so it's really clear that these pictures were not taken in Belgium and probably in the east. There was also one account of a German soldier in a prisoner of war camp in East Prussia, and he sees trains with this vehicle heading east. Maybe it's not clear if we actually saw it or not, but he wrote it down, and that might also be another small proof that the vehicles were used there. We also saw that the vehicle was used at its original purpose as an artillery tractor. We have this one picture. It was taken in Yugoslavia in the winter of 1942, and it shows a Belgian T-13 Type 3 with its armored superstructure and cannon removed, so only like the artillery tractor configuration, and also with some small adaptations such as the shortened exhaust, an MG34 added, and also this other, the Belgian armor and gun removed. And the picture was apparently taken in the winter of 1942 in Yugoslavia, which was back at that period a very active war zone where the Germans fought off partisans, and they also used a lot of other captured vehicles such as the French H-39, so other exotic vehicles which were less suitable for the front line in on the eastern front, of course. So probably also used as an artillery tractor. And we also know that the producer of the Belgian tank destroyer Type 3, Familie Reu, we know that they delivered parts for the German army for other Belgian vehicles, such as the Vickers light utility tractor. We have accounts of like the orders that the German army made for spare parts for those vehicles. So it's not really that far-fetched to think that they will also be using other vehicles, also made of Familie Reu, with also spare parts ordered from time to time. And there was also one order in 1941 given to Familie Reu for 15 heavy tractors of 55 horsepower, which is the type of horsepower that the Type 1 and 2 used, and 20 tractors for the 80 horsepower, which is the same engine as the Type 3 used. So probably also used as an artillery tractor with some spare parts added from time to time. So that's also one of the use that Germans had for it. Then a third use is as a trophy vehicle. Of course, capturing exotic vehicles during the campaigns in different countries The Germans also like to parade with their war booty, not only in the captured countries itself, but also in Germany and its other territories. And they held like trophy exhibitions for the civilians to come and see how these wars went, what was captured, and see the pride of the German army and what they subdued in all these countries. So that's the third use. And that actually brings us to the last surviving T-13.
The last surviving, how did that come to survive?
It's currently situated in the Belgian Royal Military Museum in Brussels, and it's the last one left in the world. And this vehicle, it was used by the Border Cyclist Unit, like one of these frontier units that had to perform delaying actions at the eastern province of Limburg. It took part in a few skirmishes across the Albert Canal on the first day of the invasion, fired a few shots, but already soon it had to retreat back to new positions because the German army was invading in force over there. It was abandoned together with another vehicle after mechanical issues during the retreat. And in such, it was also captured intact. Because it was abandoned on these first days, it all went very fast, of course, and the Belgian troops didn't have time to sabotage it. It was captured in a very good condition. Then this vehicle, it was probably the first of, or maybe the best of this type of vehicle captured by the Germans. So they held it off. They held on to it to be displayed in this kind of war trophy exhibitions. This one was moved to Austria, where in 1941 there was an exhibition organized called Der Sieg im Westen, the war in the West. Germany held several of these kind of exhibitions to show off captured war material. You also had one about Greece and Crete in 1941. One about art, one about Kampfraum Südost, so probably the war in the Balkan areas in 1944. So this one was displayed at a war trophy exhibition about the Battle of France and the Low Countries, actually. This expo was organized in front of the Military Museum in Vienna, right in front of it, and also at the Heldenplatz, which is another kind of courtyard in the city. After this exhibition, the vehicle probably stayed there inside the museum, became part of their collection, and actually disappeared from display until 1980. In 1980, there was a volunteer of an organization of the Belgian Army Museum. They have an organization called Tank Museum. They help out restoring the vehicles of the museum. They try to find maybe new acquisitions for the museum. So he was a member of that, and he visited the depot, the reserves of the Vienna Military Museum. And of course, he was very shocked to suddenly find in the basement the cellars of the museum this famed T-13 tank. And it was a Type 2, like one of the earlier ones with a rearward-facing cannon. So he found it there in the basement of the museum. Then starts a long process of over 3 years of getting the tank back to Belgium, actually. At first, the museum, the Vienna Military Museum, wasn't really aware that it was a special kind of vehicle. They didn't know much about it. They didn't see any problem giving back a war trophy to the country. But after doing some research, they found out, okay, this is a unique vehicle. Maybe it is worth something. And we got it by our own proper means. It was given to us by the Germans back then. Now we are owner of it. So if you want it, you will have to pay for it. They asked for a really large amount of money for it. Back then, 2.6 million francs. In Belgium, of course, this cost kind of a public outrage. There were a lot of articles in the press, like, how dare they ask money for a captured Nazi trophy? And the people were not really happy about it. So there was a lot of diplomacy needed, also some help from an Austrian military attaché in Paris, apparently, who helped to settle down the fuss and see if we could come to an agreement. And eventually, it was decided that we could have the T-13 in exchange for a German Flak 36, so an 88mm gun that they were requesting. We didn't have a spare one at the moment, so we traded one quickly with the other German museum to get a Flak 88, and then we traded that one for the T-13. So that's how we came into possession of the vehicle. They got this new vehicle. They finally got an exchange deal where they could get it. So they sent a C-130 Hercules cargo plane of the Belgian army to Vienna.
Oh, really? I assumed it would come back on a flat-back truck. I didn't really flat back. Fantastic.
It was quite a special operation. So they arranged for a large cargo plane like that to come and get it. And it was air transported back to Belgium. And here in Belgium, they found out that it was actually in quite good condition. It still had all of its original paint. It was not modified in any way. It still had its original, its hull art on top of it, which is like a little devil holding 47mm shell. in the colors of the Belgium national colors, so red, yellow, and black. Really in good condition. And they also saw that even the battery was also still the original one and quite operable. It needed a bit of TLC, but they eventually got it back into working order. And the vehicle participated in a few commemoration events in Brussels, but only for a short period of time because they really didn't want to cause any breakdowns. And of course, this is a unique vehicle. It means so much to our Belgian military history. So they decided to keep it safely in the museum, keep it in good conditions, not outside, to really preserve it in the most optimal conditions as possible.
Well, listener, we're going to pause there. We'll be back after this break. How many other Belgian-produced armoured vehicles from that period have survived?
That's simple. This one.
Is that it? That is completely unique?
Yeah. I'll maybe just quickly go over the other vehicles that we had. We had the T-13 tank destroyer, which we only have the single one surviving. Then we also had a T-15 tank. Yeah, we call it a tank, but it's more like a small chenillette, small carrier-like vehicle. Conceived to replace the Renault FT, kind of reconnaissance and infantry support vehicle, armed with a heavier machine gun, Hotchkiss machine gun. But for this vehicle, none of them are left. There were also not as much produced, but only 42 in total, but none of them have survived the campaign. Then we also had 10 Renault ACG-1s, which is more like a bit of a heavier tank, a cavalry tank, also armed with a 47mm gun. We only had 10 of them. And also none of them survived to this day, unfortunately. We bought 10 of those vehicles from Renault, but we received more turrets of the vehicle to be used in fortifications on our coastline, on our bunkers at the coast. And one of those bunker turrets actually survived, and it's also in the museum. For the other Belgian vehicles, actually none of them have survived. We did have also Vickers utility tractors, which are really tiny little tractors we used for pulling our artillery guns. None of ours have survived, but the Dutch also used them, and we have in the museum a Dutch one which was used in Indonesia, I think. So it found its way back to Europe, and we also managed to get hold of one through an exchange deal eventually. But so yeah, you can imagine that this vehicle, having survived to this day, means a lot to our Belgian military heritage, and we're very lucky to be able to display it in the museum.
It never fails to amaze me, looking back at the Second World War, of what hasn't survived. I think it's partly luck. It's partly, I think, at the end of the war, people just didn't care, so they had no interest in maintaining these things and keeping them for posterity. And so but then, in some respects, certain things seem to have survived in rather large numbers. Many other things I could never understand. I remember asking my father, "Where's your helmet and stuff?" And he came home for the war and didn't bring any of it back. He gave his uniform away. He had no interest in it. That was his war done. And the vehicles, I guess, they could get repurposed for steel and other bits and pieces. So remind us again, where we, if we want to go and see the T-13, where is it?
So the last T-13 still surviving to this day. It is being kept in the Belgian Military Museum in Brussels. It's a very large museum. You need at least 3 hours to visit all of its halls. And it's situated in a very nice, beautiful park, really close to the center of Brussels at the Jubel Park.
Well, I hope you get lots of listeners flocking to the museum to see your unique T-13. Robby, thanks for joining me. That is it for this episode. Next time, I'll be back looking at the first US Army range units from their inception to the catastrophic engagement at Cisterna in 1944. Now, if you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, you can do so via Patreon. Your support helps me keep the podcast going and allows me to produce more in-depth interviews like this one. So just head to patreon.com/WW2podcast to find out more. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice